Dr. Walford, we left yesterday having looked at Dr. Waiter's memo on leaving office.
Yes.
Just before we look at your memo,
Yes.
From September of 1979, I want to ask you to look briefly with me at a paper produced by Dr. Lane at the same time, or around the same time.
Mm-hmm.
It's CBLA 40998. And we can see it's entitled Future Preparation of Plasma Protein Fractions by NBTS, a Reassessment of Requirements. I'm not going to ask you to consider the detail with me, but just a couple of the broad points that Dr. Lane makes. So if we could go to page 2, and if we look at the paragraph at the bottom half of the page, so the penultimate paragraph beginning, the problems that exist now in the National Blood Transfusion Service are not new, but have been accumulating in severity over several years in both regional transfusion centres and at BPL. The difficulties have been accentuated by the growth in requirement during the 1970s of plasma products, an exercise in production maintained without adequate planning, coordination or finance from the outset. Do you agree with what Dr. Lane was observing there? To the extent that you're able to.
Indeed. Basically, I think he's trying to refer to the fact that the UK was aiming for self-sufficiency, but there appeared to be no overarching plan in order to achieve it. And to that extent, he's right.
And if we go to page 6, there's just a particular observation about the organisation of the National Blood Transfusion Service I wanted to ask you about. Mm-hmm. So again, it's the bottom half of the page. It's a section entitled The Central Defect in National Blood Transfusion Service Organisation. And then he says this, in spite of the Medicines Division report, it's questionable whether BPL could make a substantial increase in Factor VIII output at present because of the fall-off in fresh frozen plasma supply during 1979. Financial restrictions at RTCs are only part of the problem. And then it was this sentence, Dr. Walford, inability to coordinate the plasma programme is a central defect in NBTS organisation. And then if we just look at the next page, we can see under the heading Reorganisation of NBTS, he makes a proposal for reforming it, setting up a special health authority and so on. Again, Dr. Walford, it was really from your perspective of the years when you were involved, whether you agree with or have any observations about his concern about the organisation of the National Blood Transfusion Service.
Well, it's fair to say that the National Blood Transfusion Service was not really organised in any co-ate form that one could see. It was a loose federation of regional transfusion directors. Each regional transfusion director had an accountability to the regional health authority, either through the regional medical officer or in some other way, but basically they were little fiefdoms unto themselves. They were not centrally coordinated. The government's initial central coordinating committee for the NBTS really didn't seem to coordinate anything, and as we saw, stopped in about 1978, so it was obviously not doing any good. It was then replaced by the advisory committee on the NBTS, and I think if you say to yourself, here's an advisory committee, how likely is it it's going to be able to manage an organisation like the NBTS? But what it was aiming for was to bring together regional transfusion directors with the central blood laboratory directors and to try and get some degree of coordination. Now, Dr. Lane was entirely consistent throughout all the time I knew him. This is chaotic. It doesn't work. We absolutely have to coordinate the plasma with the BPL developments, because actually without the plasma, we're nowhere. So he was always saying there needs to be a mechanism. He was proposing quite early on, as you see, a special health authority, and of course, ultimately a special health authority, the Central Blood Laboratory Authority, was set up to actually coordinate the central blood laboratories and the sources of plasma supply. But I think what he's saying is fair comment.
And I think it's right that we can look at the documents later if we need to, but we may not need to, that the Central Committee, as you say, met in 1978 and then didn't meet again for 2 years. Didn't meet again and was disbanded in 1980, and the Replacement Advisory Committee that then set up.
Yes.
So for 2 years, there wasn't even, at what might be thought to be a very critical time, there wasn't any overarching committee in relation to NBTS. Right. So if we now go to the memo that you produced on the 19th of September 1979, it's at DHSC 303618_023. It refers to an attached scheme. So if we just look at the text of it, shall we? Thank you. So in the first paragraph, it refers to an attached scheme, and we'll look at the scheme at the moment. You say it represents my preliminary thoughts of a complex matter, or on a complex matter, which has been preoccupying you for a considerable time. I don't doubt that this scheme or something similar is but one amongst the many options which you may have been considering. Now, you were fairly new to this job at the time. I think you'd been in post probably for a matter of weeks at this
3 weeks.
point. What was it that prompted you to come up with your own thinking and formulation of options?
Well, my supposition is that I knew I was coming into a new job. I knew a little bit about this from the medicines division angle. I had Sheila Waiter's very helpful paper, which obviously I used as a quarry for my further thinking. But it also seemed to me that there was an awful lot that needed to be done, and therefore I put forward some preliminary thoughts on what might be done. I actually thought I was putting them forward only up the medical hierarchy, but when Dr. Harris saw them, he thought they ought to go further. So they went up to Mr. Wormold and to Mr. Harley as well.
And if we just look at the scheme and then come back to the text of the memo. So the scheme is at DHSC 303618_024. It's a useful way of looking at what you were putting forward. And I wonder, could you just talk us through, using this document, what it was you were suggesting?
Right, well, I'll start from my left-hand side then onwards. Basically, what I saw was, as you see, I've got Scotland at the extreme left of my diagram, where I foresaw that we would send more fresh frozen plasma to Liberton. In fact, I don't think we were sending any fresh frozen plasma to Liberton. We had in the past sent some outdated plasma for fractionation. And then my view was that you would upgrade and modify Liberton to help to increase production. But I also saw it as a kind of place where you could stockpile or keep an emergency supply of Factor VIII. In other words, it was to a degree a fallback, but also to contribute to the national effort, if you like, of England, Wales and Scotland all together. So that was my initial thoughts about Scotland. And please remember, these are initial thoughts, and obviously I wasn't at all sure how they would land apart from anything else. Then I foresaw in England that actually we would do what the Trends Working Party, if 1977, that was the last time there was a working party looking at plasma supply and what products were needed. And in 1977, excuse me, the suggestion was that cryoprecipitate production should be phased out. That was a clear recommendation from the Trends Working Party. So I picked up on that and said, right, well, if you're not making cryoprecipitate regional transfusion centres, that's all the more plasma for the blood products laboratory, so we can increase the amount of intermediate Factor VIII, which was the product of choice at the time. That's the freeze-dried product. And that was the Trends Working Party product of choice, and subsequently the Gunson Working Party in 1981. That was their product of choice as well. I then have this dotted line. I think what I was trying to say here is that there had been a Royal Commission on the NHS. There were all sorts of plans afoot for restructuring the NHS, and one wanted to make sure that everything fitted in with a restructured NHS, but I wasn't aware of what those plans would entail in detail. So moving on to the heading BPL, Obviously, we had the inspector's report. The inspector's report was damning. We needed to do something very quickly. So immediately I say, implement stopgap, please, which is why I think I was emphasizing yesterday that I didn't think it was a good idea to stopgap. But implement stopgap, and then also upgrade BPL to the extent that the Medicines Inspectorate required to make it safe. I then took up from Sheila Waiter's suggestion, because I knew we were dealing with an entity, the Blood Products Laboratory, that simply wasn't a pharmaceutical factory. It really wasn't fit to make pharmaceuticals on any scale, although it produced very good product and it went, in its low volume. So I thought it would be helpful to have a commercial firm to fractionate for the NBTS, for the UK, under contract. That was my thought initially, and that actually, I think, coincided quite a lot with what Sheila Waiter was suggesting, and Kabi, being a Swedish firm, seemed to be quite a good bet for doing that. So, and it was her suggestion, which I was actually, if you like, piggybacking on here to suggest that Kabi should maybe do that on our behalf. Then there was the question of, well, could there be some different commercial involvement, not simply contract fractionation for us, but if no firm was willing to just do that, maybe there could be some form of partnership with commerce. And so the thought was, well, immediately go into negotiations, see what Kabi could do, or Immuno, which was an Austrian company, so European, if you will. Although at the time, I didn't know that Immuno also fractionated American plasma. I just simply didn't know that. I thought it was purely European. And so I was suggesting that we ask Kabi to, as it were, keep running BPL, if you like, for 2 years. And then as BPL was upgraded, it would take over and run BPL, and then build a new plant on the Lister site and supply to the NHS for us. So it would actually be almost a nationalised, you would be using a commercial company to work for the state, fractionating our plasma. And then for Immuno, I was suggesting, again, the same time frame. And here's what I'm saying is probably controversial, but it was a suggestion because we knew that most foreign firms wanted to import plasma for fractionation, but rather than do that, for them to set up plasmapheresis centres using UK donors, which would actually, probably you would need to pay for the sort of plasmapheresis that was needed, was just a thought, and that those UK plasmapheresis donors would supply the NHS. If there were any UK-derived products which had been fractionated, which was surplus to NHS requirements, they could then be sold abroad. I thought the point of having 2 potential companies in there would be a way of not holding the NHS or the UK over a barrel, if you like, because if you didn't like what one commercial company was doing, you could actually threaten to take away what they were doing and give it to the other company. So as I say, I produced this three weeks into the job, and I really didn't know how it was going to be received, and I probably would not have put it up to others because you know how irritating it can be if a new broom comes in and makes suggestions when people have been worrying about something for a long time. But those were my initial thoughts.
May I just ask, before we move from this scheme, the one thing you didn't mention on the far left-hand side, the very bottom, is the plus R&D. That's research and development,
Yes.
I take it.
Yes.
What did you have in mind for that?
Well, basically, the BPL any fractionator needs to keep doing R&D all the time to develop their product. It's not particularly basic R&D, but they must keep developing and improving their product. BPL was doing the plasma fractionation laboratory in Oxford was almost the main centre for the research that was being done into new product development. But there was absolutely no reason, in my view, why Scotland shouldn't be doing some R&D as well. And in fact, when you will see from papers later on, they were always trying to change the composition of their products, to change the chemical constitution and so on. It's an absolutely essential part of being a fractionator. You just don't stand still. You keep looking to develop your products.
And then if we then go to the accompanying memo again, DHSC 303618_023, you can just pick it up, the paragraph number 1 and 2. You say this: if it's accepted that production at BPL should continue for the present, then stopgap or an approximate modification of it should be implemented forthwith, both to satisfy the medicines inspectors and increase production. And then 2, with agreement from ministers as necessary, and you refer to Mr. Harley's paper, we should enter into immediate and very searching negotiations with likely commercial contenders for UK fractionation. There may well be a sticking point about the margin of profit, which the DHSS and the companies each consider acceptable. It may therefore become apparent at an early stage in these negotiations that the commercial option is less open or less attractive than it currently appears. So it would appear that you were saying here whatever was done needed to be done immediately.
If 'twere done, yes.
And then we'll look at the extent to which that happened in practice. But if we just then go further down the page, you then at 3 talk about the modification of libitum, and we'll come back to the issue of how, or the extent to which that idea was taken forward. And then you refer again to plasmapheresis. We may, if time permits, come back to the question of plasmapheresis, but in case we don't, can I just ask you to tell us in a sentence or two what plasmapheresis was, and why it was being suggested?
Plasmapheresis is a way of getting more plasma from an individual donor than you could do without damaging the donor's health. So you take a unit of blood from a donor in the usual way, you centrifuge it, you spin it, you take off the plasma, you give back the red cells, which is really the cellular component of blood, which is really what people need to stop them becoming anemic and to keep all their systems going. And you keep the plasma. Now, you can then do that a couple of times so that you could get, say, 500 ml of plasma from a donor, at one sitting, whereas normally speaking, you wouldn't take more than 1 unit of blood, which may only yield less than 200 ml of plasma. So this is the system which was, of course, used extensively in America, but to an extreme degree, where they were plasmapheresing donors over and over again. I mean, in a way which cannot have been healthy for the donors themselves, because they were taking off all this plasma, which was actually contained some useful nutrition, if you like, for the body. But you could do a plasmapheresis either manually, which I've just described, or you could do it continuously in a machine. So machine plasmapheresis, manual plasmapheresis. Either way, you got more plasma than you would get if you simply took a donation of blood from a donor.
And then if we go over the page, we can see 4 lines down, the reference, as we saw in the scheme, the diagrammatic scheme, a suggestion of ceasing the production of cryoprecipitate. Now, did you at this point in time, as far as you can recall, give any consideration to what the consequences of ceasing production might be, at least in the short term, which might be a greater reliance upon imported concentrates and a greater risk of viral transmission?
Well, you know, of course, I can't think what I might have thought at that time, but I mean, one issue here was don't make cryoprecipitate at the regional transfusion centres. Send all the plasma to BPL. But cryoprecipitate is the starting material for intermediate factor VIII. So if you wanted cryoprecipitate in any volume, you could actually make it at BPL because they had to make cryoprecipitate, and then they went on to make intermediate concentrate from it. So you wouldn't actually completely avoid making cryoprecipitate if you didn't want to. You just wouldn't be making it at the regional transfusion centres, and which then meant that the plasma wouldn't be sent to BPL.
Now, can I then, we'll consider the extent to which these ideas were followed through when we look at some of the subsequent documents. But can we then just look at a couple of meetings in the same month, September of 1979? The first is at DHSC 302195_044. So this is a meeting on the 26th of September, an ad hoc group of regional transfusion directors, and we can see that you were in attendance along with Dr. Lane, Dr. Gonson, Dr. Tovey and others. And I just wanted to see whether you can assist us with the fourth paragraph, I think it is. It says, a tendency to revert to cryoprecipitate was discernible in some regions, due in part to lack of money to buy commercial concentrate or to collect more plasma for fractionation at BPL. It was agreed that this was yet another example of the way in which the use of blood products and the development of blood product production was being distorted by the availability of products which were apparently free. Wondered if you could assist us with, well, two parts of this paragraph. The first suggests that some regions at least were going back to producing more cryoprecipitate. But the second sentence, are you able to assist us with what that's referring to?
Well, I suppose the regional health authorities must have balked at buying commercial product if they thought that they could get BPL product free. Of course, BPL product wasn't free. The regional health authorities needed to pay for the plasma from the regional transfusion centres to go to BPL. There was never any proper costing of any of all this, but this was not a cost-free option, if you like, having it made at BPL, but it didn't feel as painful as the regional health authority having to put their metaphorical hand in their pocket to pay for the commercial stuff, which was very expensive.
And then if we just go to the bottom of the page, just to pick up the theme that we explored by reference to Dr. Lane's paper, we can see there is a discussion about the administration, the organisation of the blood transfusion service. And it would appear that there's a lack of unanimity or consensus about Dr. Lane's suggestion of having a special health authority and a suggestion that there should be directors coordinating the service professionally, which I suppose is what was supposed to be happening, but not quite happening in any event. Is that right?
Yes. It's interesting that Dr. Jenkins referred to reluctance for the government to set up new quangos, and that was very true. There was a cull of quangos. There was, throughout my time in the department, there was a cull of quangos, but there was always a feeling that quangos were bad, and basically they were uncontrollable, so you didn't set them up. And I think there was some reluctance on the part of the department for quite a long time to set up even a special health authority, which was not a quango in the quasi-autonomous way. It was under the control, if you like, of the health service. But there was a reluctance to set up new bodies.
And is that possibly one of the reasons why we see again and again around this time in the papers questions of new advisory groups, new working parties, new committees, etc., always had to go, it would appear, to the minister for a decision?
Yes.
And then if we turn to a meeting, I think on the same day, at CBLA 301005, this is a meeting of the Scientific and Technical Committee for the Central Blood Laboratories. And this would, I think, have been your first meeting as Joint Secretary.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
And then if we go to page 2, we can see paragraph 5 refers to the report by the medicines inspectors, and there's a discussion about the issue both of short-term upgrading and longer-term redevelopment. And if we look further down towards the bottom half of the page, the penultimate paragraph begins, Dr. Dunnell said he was disturbed by what he'd read in the report, by the absence of any clear commitment by the department to put matters right. The committee now shared with the director the responsibility for the safety of the products made at BPL. Both Dr. Dunnell and Mr. Smart expressed doubts about the advisability of proceeding with short-term measures without a commitment to the full-scale rebuilding of BPL. And then Mr. Smart's estimate of how long it could take to achieve that new building was 3 years. And then we see Mr. Harley asking whether the committee felt that they could confidently dismiss the other options set out in his paper for ministers. Members doubted whether all the options were available in practice. They agreed the right course was to recommend that no time should be lost in planning a completely new plant, even if it was felt that other possibilities had to be examined concurrently. And then if we just go to the next page, paragraph 6 refers to Mr. Harley's paper. I'm not going to take time looking at that now, but we can see in the second paragraph under that heading, there's then a debate about commercial involvement. It would, I'm summarising, but it would appear that the members of the committee are not supportive of the proposal for commercial involvement. So it would appear that there was tension between what civil servants were proposing to investigate and explore with ministers, possibly because they thought that was what ministers might be most interested in, I don't know, and what those who were members of the committee saw as the right course. Is that fair?
I think that's fair. I think one of the things that bedevils these papers, actually, when I came to look at them after all these years, was the difference between getting industry involved in fractionating our plasma, because that's what we needed. We needed that sort of industrial expertise, and actually some form of takeover by industry, which meant that, in fact, you had a wholly new company, a commercial company, which owned BPL. And then, of course, it was out of everybody's control what would then happen. So there's the difference between the two, and I'm not ever quite sure what is being referred to in these various papers. I think there's no question. Look, from the word go, the committee wanted to get on and rebuild BPL. I have to say they weren't alone in that view, but there were obstacles, because actually this was not a course of action that was immediately attractive to ministers.
When you say they're not alone in that view, I detect from your answers yesterday that you share that view.
I shared that view.
And the obstacles, if I can put it that way, were to some extent political, because decisions had to be made about funding, bids had to be made to the Treasury, and as we'll see in some of the papers, but I know you've read them all, Dr. Walford, there's reference to the new government being more in favour of the involvement of the private commercial sector than perhaps earlier governments have been.
Yes, I mean, that is obviously a factor, but I think if we're looking quite early on in the new government, in the new administration, I'm not sure how well formulated that particular sort of ideological side of things was. I don't think I was necessarily particularly aware of that. I mean, my thought was that actually ministers couldn't think of where they were going to get the money from. Basically, if they were almost reluctant, if I can say that, reluctant to think about committing to rebuild BPL, because they didn't know where the money was coming from. Now, it couldn't come from the central budget because there simply wasn't enough. The Treasury had an absolutely iron grip on finances at the time, and I think they were searching around for any other source of funding. And one of the potential sources was obviously to get commerce involved and to get them to do it.
And then I think we can see probably quite starkly the difference of approach and the difference in terms of the sense of urgency between the department and the committee if we look at two documents. The first is a note from Mr. Harley, copied to you, DHSC 302195_050. So it's Mr. Harley to Mr. Dutton. Can you just remind us who Mr. Dutton was?
He was a principal in Mr. Harley's division.
So HS2.
Yes.
And then we can see it refers to the meeting of the Scientific and Technical Committee. And then in the last main paragraph, we can see reference to Professor Mollison as chair of the Scientific and Technical Committee being anxious to begin work on detailing what would be needed in a redeveloped facility. I tried without success to discourage him, agreed if non-departmental members wanted to do this, I could hardly prevent them, but I thought officials should not be involved. We are not at a stage where planning can sensibly be started, and I made it clear that officials should not now be taking on additional work, particularly when it might prove nugatory. And then he goes on to say whatever is done shouldn't involve the expenditure of money, and there's no budget for the preparation of a development plan, and I don't think the committee is the right group to do it anyway. So that's Mr. Harley essentially saying, is this fair? Put the brakes on, because we're not at the stage of being able to start that work.
I think, to be absolutely fair to Mr. Harley, who was himself scrupulously fair and an excellent civil servant, in my opinion, to be fair to him, he knew that there wasn't ministerial approval. We hadn't obtained ministerial approval yet. We certainly would need to before going ahead and committing to rebuilding, and indeed to any degree of additional expenditure. So although this looks very negative and a drag anchor, if you like, he probably had to do that because that was his job.
And then if we look at what was produced by the chair, by Professor Mollison at DHSC 302195_069, if we just zoom in a little closer, so we can see it's a memorandum by the chairman, and then paragraph 2 refers to the medicines inspection report, and then says remedial actions of two kinds is needed. Money is required immediately to upgrade the existing facilities. A completely new plant must be planned and built with the greatest urgency. If the above two steps are taken, there will be a reasonable defence against any possible accidents which may occur. And then 3, the committee has in fact been emphasising the need for new plant for some time. The inspector's report simply increases the urgency of this requirement. And then there's reference to the economic justification. That was Mr. Smart's paper. And then at paragraph 4, I'm not going to go through the detail of it, but he sets out his concerns about commercial involvement, and describes it as a retrograde step at the end of the page. So, again, trying to take it fairly quickly, but I hope fairly, he's saying
Get
the
on with
accelerator
it.
on,
Get
not
on
the
with it.
brakes.
Yes.
And then there's a meeting, a departmental meeting on the 10th of October, DHSC 302325_036. We can see it involved largely those working for the department, but also Dr. Tovey, presumably in his capacity as consultant advisor to the CMO. It's 10th of October 1979. Mm-hmm. We can see reference under paragraph 2 to your minute of the 19th of September and the flow chart. And then it talks about the principles of commercial involvement. It was recognised that in general, ministers favoured transfer to functions from the public sector, transfer of functions from the public sector to the private sector where this is likely to improve efficiency, and then reference to Mr. Smart's view to the contrary, that this should be done by the NHS. And then the next paragraph, it was agreed that undertakings to move towards national or NHS self-sufficiency in blood products did not preclude industrial participation in the purely technical process of fractionating plasma. And then we have Dr. Tovey setting out his concerns, and Mr. Harley, bottom of the page, referring to possible union concerns. If we then go over the page, we can see what the upshot of the meeting is. It was agreed that Mr. Harley should continue with his options paper, but in practice there appear to be only 2 courses to put to ministers: spend the minimum necessary to upgrade BPL while at the same time rebuilding and expanding the laboratory within the NHS, using NHS capital if available or seeking alternative sources of funds if not. 2, spend the absolute minimum to satisfy the medicines inspectors and seek an agreement with industry to fraction NHS plasma and so on. It was agreed the first practical step was to find out as soon as possible what facilities industry was able to offer and on what terms. So is this right? There's an internal departmental decision to investigate further the contribution that could be made by commerce, by industry, before anything's going to be put to ministers.
Well, I think actually they had to approach ministers on the question of involving industry anyway.
Yes. So it's a decision to find out more about the possibility of commercial involvement at that point in time. And then if we pick that up in a memo from Mr. Wormold, DHSC 303743_193. This is the following day. It refers to the meeting, and you're right. The meeting is it's now talking about what they're going to put to ministers. Paragraph 2. It suggests that we shall seek agreement to entering into discussions via supply division with the interested commercial firms. And then paragraph 3 refers to the choice that will have to be put to ministers. And then bottom of the page, we can see this. It refers to a draft. I think that was a draft of proposed letter to the Medicines Inspectorate. Yep. We don't need to worry about that. But if we pick it up halfway down that paragraph, Mr. Wormold says the availability of this money, so further expenditure for BPL, can by no means be assumed. Certainly there'll be no extra in 1979-80. Until we've explored the financial position further, we cannot put forward these proposals to Medicines Division except in very tentative and contingent terms. And then over the page, there's a reference in paragraph 7 to the possibility of sending a holding reply to the Medicines Division, and then a reference in paragraph 8 to suggesting to Mr. Nodder, is that? Mm-hmm. He should call an early meeting. And who was Mr. Nodder?
He was Mr. Wormold's boss. He was the Deputy Secretary.
Again, it would appear to be the proposal is to, as it were, tentatively approach ministers. Is that fair?
Yes, I mean, the draft that I had written to respond to Medicines Inspectorate, which of course I have reviewed because you sent it to me, actually I found it quite difficult to be critical of that draft. I wasn't entirely sure what Mr. Wormold was concerned about, but of course it's perfectly obvious that I was, in effect, it was implicit in my draft that rebuilding would be done, that we would one way or another rebuild BPL. And meanwhile, these were the proposals that we had to upgrade the BPL insofar as we could to meet their requirements. You could never have met all of the Medicines Division requirements without a rebuild, but you could get to the point where you hoped to satisfy them to a degree. And obviously also perhaps then to be able to increase production. The problem with my draft, as I see it, is that it was implicit that we were going to rebuild, and we hadn't got ministerial permission. So obviously, Mr. Wormold was right, if you like, to rein back and say, I have problems with Dr. Walford's draft, though he hasn't actually spelled that out, but that is clearly what he meant. At least I hope that's all he meant, because otherwise I thought it was a jolly good draft.
And then if we just go to DHSC 303813_052, we can see from this letter from Mr. Dutton to Dr. Lane, 6th of December 1979, there's an agreement to proceed with some reasonably limited interim works and investigations on the basis it doesn't involve any further expenditure. It comes out of the existing allocation. We don't need to go through the details of the works, but is it right to understand then that it's taken, by this time, well over 6 months to get from the damning inspection report even to some limited interim works in response? Now, you were only in post for the last period of that, so my question doesn't suggest that that's something for which you bear responsibility. But do you have any observations on that timescale, on how long it took even to get to that?
Well, my observation about the whole thing and taking a sort of helicopter view over all the papers that you've sent me is that it took an unconscionable time to get submissions to ministers, to get responses from ministers, to move on. I mean, I think just looking across all the ministerial submissions, it was a year from when I think I wrote my draft to the Medicines Inspectorate report, my draft to Medicines Inspectors, to actually coming at the end of the day to the decision which was finally taken to rebuild BPL. So it was an extraordinarily lengthy business. That isn't to say it wasn't complex. It was very complex, and I don't want to underplay that. But everything did seem to take an unconscionable length of time, and in essence, one would like to have thought you could shave off some element of the time that it took.
And then we can see a submission to ministers going in late December 1979 at DHSC 0002307 049. Start with. Do you have that? DHSC 302307_049. So this just gives us the date. It's the 20th of December 1979. It's Mr. Harley to Mr. Nodder, and it refers to the accompanying paper. And it's a rewrite of that draft submission that we looked at yesterday that you prepared an initial draft of. And then if we go to the actual submission, DHSC 302307_050. Just perhaps note, whilst we're here, paragraph 3, which says heavy reliance on commercial overseas supplies conflicts with the World Health Organization resolution to which the UK was party, that all countries should be self-sufficient in blood and blood products. It also increases greatly the risk of transmitting hepatitis. So whether that's been spelt out to ministers before or not, it's been spelt out to ministers here. And then I won't go through the detail of it with you, but if we go to page 5, I think, Shomik, we can see what ministers are being asked to decide. Decisions required, paragraph 18. Ministers are asked to agree that the BPL should continue to function until it can be replaced on the basis of a short-term upgrading, accepting that this will fall short of the upgrading recommended by Medicines Division. B, to decide in principle to rebuild the BPL, but without any commitment as to the method or precise timing. C, to agree to further exploration of the possibilities of rebuilding either within the NHS or in collaboration with industry. So is it right to understand it's still very much a provisional situation? Get some short-term works done, an in-principle agreement in relation to BPL, but whether it's going to be NHS, whether it's going to be a full redevelopment, whether it's going to avoid commerce, how long it will take, all of that is still up in the air.
Yes, that's right.
And then if we look at the ministerial responses, DHSC 302307_002, we have the response here from PSH, so the Parliamentary Under Secretary of State, who was George Young, I understand, who says perhaps the minister should visit Elstree. I think we should aim at cutting out imports. I think the private sector could have a role to play in the new setup. And then we see the response of Gerald Vaughan, who was the Minister of State for Health at DHSC 0002307_047. And it says MSH, so that's the Minister of State for Health, a senior minute dated the 21st of December 1979. He's agreed to recommendations A and C, but not to B. He's asked to be kept in close and regular touch on this. And so just to remind us, he's agreed, therefore, to some short-term upgrading, which was A. He's agreed to exploratory discussions with industry or investigations with industry. He's not even agreed to an in-principle commitment to rebuild BPL.
That's right.
And then if we just pick up the Scientific and Technical Committee then in January of 1980, CBLA 301052, we can see the date of there is the 23rd of January, and we can see that you're in attendance as Joint Secretary. If we go to the second page, I think if we just look at the top half of the page and we pick it up about 6 lines in, it refers to Mr. Smart thinking that the position which the department appeared to be taking up was not an attractive one. Dr. Dunnell remarked that it was not one which was in any way technically acceptable. The committee agreed that as presented to them, they could not endorse the views attributed to ministers. And then there's reference to the short-term upgrading. Go a little further down, we can see Dr. Lane saying he felt he was in an invidious position. And then the next paragraph records Mr. Harley explaining ministers decided to defer the eventual decision on building a new laboratory within the NHS until the other possibilities had been investigated. I'm not going to go through the rest of this, or indeed the meeting of the Joint Management Committee, which met the following month, but it's right to say they weren't particularly happy with the department's decision or the minister's decision.
Absolutely.
Now, you accompanied Dr. Vaughan as Minister of State for Health on his visit to BPL on the 21st of March 1980, but I understand from your statement you don't have any actual recollection of that.
None at all.
So if we go to a document which records the visit, it's DHSC 302307_041. And we can see it says note of a meeting at Elstree on the 21st of March 1980. MSH is as I understand it, Dr. Gerald Vaughan.
Yes.
And then we can see who else was there, including you and 3 of the members of the, Dr. Lane as director, and then 3 members of the Scientific and Technical Committee. And then if we look down the page, we can see, just trying to find the reference I have. Yes, paragraph 3, expenditure on upgrading. The last sentence, the Minister of State, MSH, said he was anxious that such short-term expenditure should be kept to the bare minimum. Now, was that on financial grounds, funding restraints, as far as you know?
Well, I think it was a difficult thing for the minister to have said in terms that he hadn't committed to a rebuild. I think had he committed to a rebuild and it could be started immediately, of course it would still take a number of years, but actually then spending on an upgrade of the existing building might have been, to a certain extent, a nugatory expenditure, you might say. That is presumably his thinking. I think the problem was that he hadn't committed to a rebuild, and therefore there was a suggestion that we don't know if it's going to be rebuilt. We don't know how much is going to be allowed to be expended on upgrading, and actually whatever might be thought to be appropriate for upgrading expenditure was to be kept now to a minimum.
And then we can see that then follows a detailed discussion about commercial involvement, and picking it up 4 lines down. At present, no British firm had the necessary expertise in the manufacture of blood products, and only foreign firms had approached the department with a view to processing British plasma on the existing basis, and in addition to processing and re-importing plasma from overseas. And then we have Dr. Lane saying that the American companies wanted to establish themselves, and they liked the idea of the UK because of what was said to be a lack of controls over the collection of blood. And then bottom of the page, we can see the Minister of State ruled out a partnership between the NHS and a foreign firm. So is it right to understand a decision was taken at this meeting by the Minister that whilst commercial involvement would be explored, it had to be with a British and not a foreign firm?
Yes, I don't think he was taking that decision on the hoof. I think it was a decision he'd taken. I can't point you to the particular paper, but I'm pretty sure that he'd already decided. Because of the representations that have been made, I can't fix the dates in my mind now, but basically there was a whole paper written for ministers about what firms might be available, what industry might be able to do, and whether there were any commercial firms, foreign commercial firms available. And I think that officials had concluded that actually it was going to be even more complex to involve a foreign firm than potentially involving a UK firm, though that was going to be difficult enough.
And obviously there are thousands of documents
Yes.
that we could look at, and you'd be here for a lot longer than 3 days if we did, Dr. Walford. So I'm obviously
Thank you.
taking you only to certain highlights. I think it's right that there had been, in fact, even before Dr. Waiter's memo in August of 1979, there'd been some approaches from time to time
Yes.
and discussions with commercial companies, and suspicion being expressed by some departmental officials as to the motivation of commercial companies,
Yes.
essentially, particularly the American pharmaceutical companies.
Just before we move from this particular document, can you help me with what might have been meant by the relative lack of controls over the collection of blood in this country?
Well, it's quite extraordinary, actually. Compared with what was going on in the United States, for example, I just find it an extraordinary thing for anybody to have said. Somebody is alleging that American companies thought that it would be good to set up in the UK because there were fewer controls. Although the NBTS was not particularly well managed, and to suggest that the ways in which they were actually securing their donations were less well controlled than the American products. It seems to me the American donations, given that what we know about plasmapheresis in America, I mean, that seems to me rather extraordinary. I think, to try to work out what might be meant, at the time, the inspectorate might not have, the medicines inspectorate, been inspecting regional transfusion centres themselves. They were intending to, and certainly I think that subsequently happened. So maybe it was said that the FDA inspected these premises in America. I don't know. But I don't think one could say for half a second that the plasma provided by the UK blood transfusion service was any less safe than the plasma provided by the American voluntary donor service.
And then, so we can see there the record, as I read out, of no British firm at present having the necessary expertise. If we go over the page, we can see paragraphs 5 and 6 record, in particular, Mr. Smart, and again, I'm going to summarise rather than read it all out, saying it's going to be difficult to devise a package that works for a British firm, but we can try. And he records in paragraph 6 his initial contacts with pharmaceutical companies have not been promising, and we can see he maintains his advice not to involve the private sector. But the decision that's recorded, as you say, may have been taken already, but the decision that's then recorded at paragraph 7 is that the involvement of British firms shouldn't be ruled out at this stage. He asked officials to consider the possibility of devising a package of BTS and non-BTS items which might make the proposition commercially more attractive. And then we can see the conclusions in paragraph 9, agreed that the voluntary blood donor system should be maintained, coordination between BPL and regional transfusion centres should be improved, the existing laboratory should be kept going while its future was being considered, and that BPL should be rebuilt either as an entirely NHS concern or in partnership with a British and not a foreign company, and the possibility of making such a partnership attractive to a British firm should be explored urgently. And then top of the next page, expenditure on upgrading should be reviewed and minimised pending a decision on the laboratory's future. So that's where we get to by the end of March of 1980.
Could we just come back? I'm sorry to ask you again about an expression in this letter to see what you can help with. But if we go back to the page before, he describes BPL as a money spinner for the government. If we further up the page.
Paragraph 6, second paragraph.
What did he mean by that?
Well, let me try. I would suppose that actually if BPL were allowed to manufacture to its utmost possibilities in a new factory, it would save vast sums of money. Because if you accept Mr. Smart's analysis, broadly speaking, it was absolutely going to save the government across the board money, because regions would not be spending on the very expensive commercial products. And the payback, it seemed, whether or not you accept the actual time frame that Mr. Smart proposed, which was a bit optimistic maybe, but nevertheless, I think everybody in the department and the finance people as well accepted that the payback would be quick and that we would then thereafter be actually making money from or rather saving money from the expenditure that was being...
Well, it's that difference between making and saving, which is implicit in the word money spinner. I mean, it's not, this is, on the face of it, not talking about saving money, which I can well understand on the basis you've just set out, but it's making money as if it were a commercial concern.
Well, yes, and there was a consideration at some stage that the BPL actually had spare material from its manufacture that was absolutely surplus to UK requirements and that they would then be throwing away, which is what they were doing. So if this material was actually something that other countries wanted or could form the basis of some of their own fractionation and they would pay for it, then potentially, since it was surplus to NHS requirements and it would otherwise be thrown away and on no other basis, that could be used as a way of earning some money for the UK government.
Yes, thank you.
And then I'm not going to take time putting it on screen, but there's also a note of a meeting between the Minister and union representatives on the same occasion, on the same visit, at which the Minister promised a final decision on the future of the laboratory would be taken as soon as possible. I'll just give the reference for the record, but I'm not going to go to it. It's CBLA 301085. I then want to pick matters up in April of 1980, at the next meeting of the Scientific and Technical Committee, CBLA 0001093. So we can see the date of the meeting is the 23rd of April 1980. If we go to the bottom of the second page, we see, picking up in the last paragraph, Mr. Smart repeating his concern about how realistic it was to find a British company that could take on the task. He repeats that there's no British company with fractionating expertise. And then top of the next page, he sets out a number of reasons why it might be difficult to find a British company willing to engage. I'm not going to go through them in detail, but we can see just below that Mr. Harley says that the Minister will be advised of Mr. Smart's views. And then if we go to the next section, progress with the redevelopment of BPL, if we look at the second paragraph under that heading, ministers recognised there were difficulties at the BPL which needed to be resolved. They and the department would accept responsibility for these deficiencies. However, Medicines Division's requirements for improvements had to be considered in the light of the present financial situation, and the department had accordingly agreed a package of measures which had been approved by the STC. Ministers were now asking that these measures be re-examined to see if there might be scope for further savings. So is it right to understand from this that that which had previously been agreed was now in doubt, simply in terms of some of the short-term interim measures?
Unfortunately, yes.
And you say in your statement, I think, that would have been most unwelcome for Dr. Lane to hear.
Yes.
And then if we go to CBLA 0003243. There's another internal meeting. This is the 29th of April, 1980. And I really just picking up on what we saw in the Scientific and Technical Committee, we can see here Dr. Harris explaining that although a programme of improvements had been agreed for BPL and budget provision made accordingly, Dr. Vaughan had given specific instructions that the proposal should be completely re-examined with a view to cutting the cost very substantially. So that's a direct ministerial decision rather than something that's been recommended by the civil servants.
Yes.
And then there's reference to what may have been, I think at this stage, supposition rather than a ministerial decision. The Minister was clearly looking at the requirement against the background that there would be a totally new BPL, although this decision had not been formally promulgated. Because I think there still was as yet no final decision on whether there would be a new BPL. And then I wonder if you can help us with a minute that Dr. Harris sent to you and Mr. Wormold. It's DHSC 0002307_042. th of May 1980 from Dr. Harris to you and Mr. Wormold. It refers to the meeting that we just looked at. And then he says, 4 lines down, I'm concerned we should finalise our submission to ministers as soon as possible. And then this, if ministers do not like the results of our reappraisal, it is up to them to carry the responsibilities and the subsequent serious consequences. Can you help us with understanding why you think Dr. Harris might have written in those terms?
I think he was exasperated. I think we all were exasperated.
Because he thought ministers were taking the wrong course?
There was a clear course of action which was necessary at that time. It was barn door obvious. And yet, somehow or other, it wasn't possible to make progress. And so what Dr. Harris was doing there was actually saying, we must get on. He was encouraging that final submissions should go to ministers and that ministers should be encouraged to understand that at the end of the day, they took responsibility if something went wrong.
And is it right to understand we're still talking about what should be done in the short term here?
Absolutely, in terms of keeping things going for the short term, but there had to be a commitment to rebuild, because without that, clearly that the entire edifice was not going to be fit for purpose.
And then, for I think, for the sake of completeness, we should look at DHSC 302313_046. This is Dr. Harris, 9th of June 1980, again to you and to Mr. Wormold, saying in that first paragraph, we've got the further information we needed from Dr. Lane, and this is halfway down, the critical factor is that close examination of the proposed expenditure does not indicate any possible savings, and in fact we're going to ask Dr. Lane to increase production. There may be if we're going to ask Dr. Lane to increase production, there may be a slight increase in costs. These factors should not deter us from getting a submission to ministers as soon as possible. So is this right, that the civil servants were going to be actually going back to ministers and saying, we can't make you the savings you've asked us to make, and if anything, you're going to have to agree to spend more money just on the short term?
And indeed, that's precisely what happened. Had to spend considerably more money than had initially been the intention, and certainly there was no question of a reduction in the amount of money that was going to be spent in the short term, which is, of course, what Dr. Vaughan had hoped there would be.
And we can see in the same month you write a memo to Dr. Harris. It's at DHSC 302307_008. I'm not going to go through it in great detail. It's dated the 12th of June 1980. And again, it's talking about a submission on short-term upgrading. Is it right, if we pick it up just halfway down the page, you say, I think this will miss the central issue. In my view, the essence of the question is the upgraded BPL to be a forerunner of a new laboratory or not? Is this right? You were saying, rather than, and I'm paraphrasing, so please say if I'm wrong, rather than make an ad hoc decision about short-term improvements and don't take a decision about the longer term, you've got to do both, and you've got to do now, because decision on the longer term will help you decide what you need to do in the shorter term.
Exactly.
And then we can see, if we just pick it up at DHSC 302315_006, sorry, 007. We're now the second half of July, or 18th of July, and we've got some discussions, it looks like on a fairly provisional basis, with some British firms have begun. So we have Beecham's interested in taking discussions further, and there's going to be a pre-meeting and then a meeting with Beecham's to consider possible principles. So it's still quite a drawn-out process that might be contemplated. And Mr. Hart, who is in the supply division, remains sceptical, we see from paragraph 2, but thinks it's worth trying. And there's also reference to discussing possibilities with two other companies, Boots and Fisons. Now, if we then look at the ministerial submission, which is at SCGV 40127_046, we can see it's provided under this memo dated the 24th of July 1980 to Mr. Knight. Who was Mr. Knight?
He was, I think it was Dr. Vaughan's private secretary, but I couldn't be absolutely certain.
That sounds right. And then, I'm not going to go through the detail of the submission, but we can pick it up, I think, just in two paragraphs. So paragraph 2 on page 2. It says officials have reviewed with the director, so with Dr. Lane, the proposed short-term measures, taking account of the possibility of increased production, and the recommendation is capital expenditure of 1.3 million over this year and next, and increased revenue expenditure of 0.1 million to come into effect over the same period. And if we go to page 5, page 6, show me. Paragraph 16, we can see the decision that ministers are being asked to agree is whether a revised programme of improvements to BPL should be put in hand. So again, important to understand, we're in late July 1980, and this is now a decision about interim measures still.
Yes.
So over a year since the medicines inspection report.
Yes.
I don't think we need to go to it, but this proposal was agreed by a minister within a few days. If we then look at CBLA 301171, we're now in September of 1980. This is a further meeting of the Scientific and Technical Committee. And again, you're in attendance as Joint Secretary. And if we go to the bottom of page 2, we can see from paragraph 8, no doubt pursuant to the ministerial approval from at the end of July, that the upgrading work has now started and is progressing. And then the long-term redevelopment is discussed. We can see from paragraph 9, officials have been instructed by ministers to investigate the possibility of collaborating with private industry. Initial discussions had taken place. Paper was to be submitted to ministers setting out advantages and disadvantages of such an arrangement. And then we can see again, paragraph 10, the committee, or at least several members of the committee, expressing concern at the possibility of a commercial company taking over BPL. So we are, in September, it would appear still at the stage of initial discussions only with possible British firms.
Yes.
And then I think it's within that context that we go back to your memo of the 15th of September 1980, which we looked at yesterday when we were looking at hepatitis. And I'll just look at this before we break. WITN 0282008. So this is your memo about the possible takeover by industry. You say, I think it's best if I can find my comments on the possible takeover of BPL by Beecham's, which I think by now was the only possible contender.
That's right.
To purely technical and medical comments, although I do have major worries about many other aspects of the proposals, as I think you yourself have. What were you referring to there in terms of your other worries?
Well, I think I was as concerned. I mean, everybody in the department who was looking at this could see the enormous complexities of actually trying to involve a firm in doing this for the blood transfusion service, if you like. And those were quite well set out in the submission, which ultimately went to ministers about the involvement of industry. So whichever way you looked at it, it was going to be complex, and negotiations were going to be difficult. And the question became, how confident would we have been that we could keep people to their agreement once the setup had been handed over? So I think everybody had a very big question mark over the whole feasibility of going with any firm, Beecham's or any other firm. But I wasn't in this particular minute trying to comment on that, because that was already understood and everybody was thinking about it and working out how to express those problems.
And then we can see paragraph 1, you say the principal medical worry is presented by Beecham's intention to import plasma for fractionation. Unless it were Beecham's intention to process such plasma in an entirely separate plant or with complete duplication of all facilities in a single plant, it would be impossible to prevent contamination of the UK material with imported hepatitis viruses. And then we looked at what you set out below yesterday. So you're raising a concern about imported plasma and risk of hepatitis. Mm-hmm. And then you say this, in my view, the department has a moral obligation to ensure that any collaboration with industry does not increase the health hazards, not only to recipients of blood products, but to the community as a whole. Can you just help us with understanding why you characterised it in those terms, what you meant by a moral obligation?
Moral obligation was, it's not something that I was trying to say, don't actually proceed with a plan that potentially could damage the health, not solely of the recipients of blood products, but because this was a communicable disease, but also the community as a whole. So I hope it sort of speaks for itself. I was concerned about the health impacts of potentially contaminating the UK plasma supply that was being used to fractionate and to make factor VIII and other products.
So would it be right to understand that essentially what you're saying, it would be a morally wrong thing to do?
That's what I think I was trying to say, yes.
So that's your first concern, and then your second concern, paragraph 2, was that if the department didn't agree to imported plasma, Beecham's would probably feel constrained to obtain the necessary extra volume of plasma by buying it in the UK, and you were concerned that that would lead to the establishment of plasmapheresis centres for paid donors and undermine the voluntary donor principle in the UK. It's probably fairly self-evident as to what you're saying there. You then refer to a visit to Liberton and the possibility of Liberton expanding production, which obviously your memo a year earlier had outlined. And I'll come back to the question of what happened in relation to Liberton in due course. And then, if you go over the page, you comment on certain figures in terms of demands for plasma. I'm not going to ask you about the detail of that. But I just wanted to ask you about the last 4 lines. You say that the projected requirements of factor VIII, which were based on advice given to the department earlier this year, may have to be reviewed in the face of very recent evidence which indicates that UK clinicians are coming under pressure from various quarters to step up the dosage regime for the home treatment of haemophilia. Are you you able to assist us with what that refers to? What was the pressure and who were the various quarters?
I don't know precisely who were the various quarters, but basically there was pressure to do more by way of prophylaxis. I think that's presumably what I must have meant by that. Essentially, we knew that whatever amount of factor VIII was currently being used, and the projections were that we were going to need more. The projections which were being considered were 90 million international units. Certainly Dr. Lane's view was we needed to plan for 120 million international units based on what he could see was the likely usage.
So that's probably the right point at which to take a break.
Yes, well, let's take a break now until 12:45.